Good afternoon. I'm Goldie Holtzman. It is my pleasure on behalf of the VPI Department of Statistics and my colleague Jan Lee in the Department of Computer Science to welcome you to Good Talking, an interview of I.J. Good by Persi Diaconis. Professor Good was born in London in 1916 and educated at Cambridge under A.S. Besicovitch and G.H. Hardy. From 1941 to 45 during World War II, he took part as the main statistician under, in turn, Alan Turing, Hugh Alexander, and Max Newman in the successful effort at Bletchley Park to break the German Enigma and other ciphers. Since then, Dr. Good has served as lecturer in mathematics and electronic computing at Manchester University, in the United Kingdom's Government Communications Headquarters, as a visiting research professor at Princeton University, as a consultant for IBM, in the Admiralty Research Laboratory as a senior research fellow at Trinity College, Oxford, and at the Atlas Computer Laboratory. In 1967, Dr. Good came to Virginia Tech, as Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University is now popularly known. In 1969, he became one of the initial university distinguished professors. He is now also an adjunct professor of the Center for the Study of Science in Society and an adjunct professor of philosophy. Jack Good has received many more honors than I can reasonably list now, but I should mention two of the most recent. In 1985, he was named a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and in 1990, he became one of only 8 honorary members of the International Statistical Institute. Jack's good friend, Persi Diaconis, was born in 1945 and educated in mathematics at the City College of New York and in mathematical statistics at Harvard University. Professor Diaconis has taught at Stanford and MIT, and he has worked and consulted with Bell Labs, Scientific American, the Jet Propulsion Laboratories, and the Stanford Linear Accelerator. He is now professor of mathematics at Harvard. Persi is a MacArthur Fellow and a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Now, without further delay, I leave you with these most interesting gentlemen for what is sure to be good talking. Persi.
I'm very pleased to be able to conduct an interview with Jack. You're one of my heroes, and I get to ask some of those questions which I wanted to ask for years. I think in order to just have some structure in what will probably be a pretty freewheeling conversation, maybe proceeding roughly temporally as much as we can make some sense. So to begin at the beginning, you were born in England and had a mother and father, and would you tell just a few words about your parents? Because I think people don't know that side of you at all.
Well, my father was originally Polish, and he did not approve of the Polish government very much, so he escaped from Poland in a state of poverty. He hid under a seat in a train with a large cheese that he used as a pillow and, if necessary, to bribe the man who came to collect tickets. He started up in London, first as a watchmaker. He learnt how to become a watchmaker by simply watching someone mending watches in a window, and then took up the trade for himself. And later became an antique jeweller. In fact, he rose to become one of the servers of the Queen, so he got a coat of arms. He was also an author, and he even tried a little bit of sculpting, though I think not very successfully. My mother did not receive very much education, but she was probably quite an able student when she was young, but she didn't keep up with her education much. But both my parents were very much in favor of education and had great respect for it, which is perhaps a Jewish tradition to some degree.
You wrote about a game you used to play with your father concerning guessing at time, which had a rather unusual set of rules. Could you Do you recall that game? Or would you recall
yes, we
it
played
for
this
us?
game once when going for a walk in the country. Whoever guessed closer to the correct time, which we looked up afterwards, of course, would gain a factor by which they were closer to the truth. But I just learnt about logarithms, so I took logarithms. We were able to add the scores as we went along. Of course, that mystified my father, because although he did educate himself, he never educated himself in the sciences.
How old would you have been, roughly, at that time?
13.
I see.
I'm pretty sure I was 13.
And at around that same time, you discovered for yourself things like algebraic numbers or transcendental numbers and...
Well, not exactly. When I was 9, I think nearly 10, I was in hospital with diphtheria. And just before I went in hospital, I was shown by my sister how to extract a square root. So I began trying to compute what the square root of 2 was, which I thought would eventually terminate. And of course, after about 15 places of decimals, I began to suspect that it would not terminate. And I was then able to prove rather easily that it couldn't, because the last digit, whatever it was, would not be 0 when squared. And then I thought, well, perhaps it would be a recurring decimal. So I began looking at a squared equals 2b squared. And I did it experimentally, but I always missed by 1. And I discovered a way of finding, in effect, an infinite number of solutions to Pell's equation, which is a squared equals 2b squared plus or minus 1. But I did prove that the square root of 2 could not be a rational number, and I had never even heard of irrational numbers at that time.
That's a wonderful thing to have done and to remember. So you had some gift for mathematics.
To such an extent, really, when I was at high school, and I'm talking about high school, that I really felt that mathematics was almost my middle name. If anyone used the word mathematics, I'd say yes, or something like that. When I went to Cambridge, I discovered that there were other people who were just as good as I was at mathematics. That was a different population.
Depressing, isn't it?
Yes.
I remember well going to Harvard and feeling the same feeling of hope. At Cambridge, you studied under 2 mathematicians who will go down in our history, Besikovich and Hardy. And would you?
Yes, Besikovich was my director of studies first, when I was doing my doctoral work. And that was for about a year, and then he had a sabbatical so that he wasn't taking any students, so I then transferred, and G.H. Hardy accepted me as a student. I was fairly successful with Besikovich. I won a Smith's Prize, which is quite a nice thing to get. With Hardy, I did some research. I really wrote about 3 theses for getting my PhD. My Jesus College tutor told me that if you get a Smith's Prize, then a fortiori you'll get a PhD. So I could have simply stopped work, but that wasn't my style at that time.
Would those have been your first few papers, these several theses that you wrote?
Yes, I think that's
on fractional dimension and
yes,
monotone measurable functions?
That's right, apart from a rather childish article about mathematics and chess, which I wrote for the undergraduate magazine.
Now, Erdős, who's even older than you,
if possible.
Erdős told me that Hardy had no feeling whatsoever for probability. And he was referring to Hardy's work with Ramanujan on sort of the statistics of the number of prime divisors, and whereas if one knew anything about probability, it would have been pretty easy, and they just had to grind away, fearfully in order to get results which are pretty easy to do. Does that ring true to you?
It could be true. Certainly Hardy felt that a theorem was not proved until it was really fairly rigorously proved. Ramanujan did not have that point of view. He was very much an experimentalist. And according to Hardy, Ramanujan never really fully understood what was meant by mathematical proof. But it's not entirely true about this probability business. I mentioned a probability interpretation of some mathematical theorem, and Hardy said one can often give a probability interpretation to a mathematical proposition, so he wasn't dead against. I mean, for example, there's a little theorem about 1 plus or minus a half, plus or minus a third, plus or minus a quarter, and so on. If they're all pluses, you get a divergent series. But in practice, I think you can say that almost certainly you will get a convergent series.
Right.
And I think Hardy was familiar with that.
I see that interpretation, and that helps for me. Besikovich did know some probability, I think. I don't know.
Yes. In fact, he showed me a game which I think required probability thinking once, and he then played me and beat me hollow.
At that time, you were a pretty serious gamesman. You were a chess player and anything else, probably.
That may have been the reason why Besikovich showed me this game, just to pull me down a peg or two, perhaps. I don't know. Besikovich had a lovely Russian accent, you know. Instead of saying involved, for example, he'd say involved with 2 W's. And he once said, if he makes any mistakes in his English, he asked me to correct him. I said, I don't want to correct your English. People like the way you speak.
And he could accept that.
I don't know whether he accepted it or not.
So none of your early work was in probability or statistics. Can you recall your first contact with probabilistic ideas or statistical ideas?
I'm not sure about my first. Well, I can say this, that when I was at high school, I did read Keynes's treatise on probability, though I didn't understand it all. But I did, I think, plough through it right from the beginning.
Wow.
And I also had met Ramsey's, F.P. Ramsey's work on probability. It so happened that the Hendon Public Library was in an intellectual area, so to speak, and it had those 2 books on the shelves, which is not normal for an ordinary public library.
But what were you, a lad of what, 17 or so, doing in the Hendon Public Library, prowling around reading Keynes? I mean...
Oh, well, I had a ticket for the library. I used to borrow books regularly from the Hendon Public Library. For example, the old Strand magazine with the Conan Doyle stories and H.G. Wells stories. It was a very famous periodical or magazine at that time.
So we've started you on Keynes, and so you just picked it up off the shelf and said, "What's this?" And
oh yes, and then I learnt some of the calculus probability from a chapter of Hall and Knight's algebra.
I see.
I think it may be the last chapter in Hall and Knight, and I was quite fascinated by the elements. For example, if you toss a coin 20 times, I found it surprising that you got 10-10 as often as you do. So I began betting against the other kids at the high school, giving them at first evens on that, which of course was absurd, because I realized very soon that by the time we'd reached 9-10, there was a half chance it would go the wrong way for me, so it couldn't possibly be as good as evens.
That's funny. That's funny. So you had some feeling for that among many other parts of mathematics. You were broadly self-taught, or?
Well, not exactly. They stopped teaching me in ordinary classes at a certain stage. They could see that I could learn much faster from books with a little bit, of course, of attention from the schoolmasters. And they, one particular schoolmaster named H.C. Oliver, recommended the books that I should read. One of them was Edwards's Differential Calculus, which I enjoyed.
In my preparing for this interview, I called statisticians all over the country and asked what would you like to ask Jack Good if you could? And almost all of them snuck in something about, I'd love to know more about what he was actually doing at Bletchley Park.
Quite a lot of those details are now in the public domain. But one idea of Turing's was to name a unit for weight of evidence, as I would call it. He didn't use the expression weight of evidence, but Charles S. Persi in 1878 had used the expression weight of evidence essentially in the same sense. And of course the notion of weight of evidence is clearly of certainly at least a philosophical interest to begin with. And it seems to me rather a romantic thought, and more than just that the ancient Greeks had a goddess, Themis, who had two scales, who obviously had the basic concept, better even than in the Greek language. I've consulted some of our Greek scholars, but that goddess seems to me to have had a better idea of what weight of evidence was all about. One is concerned there, clearly, because of the two scales, with some kind of an additive measure, and one could say, too, that one is concerned with the weight of evidence from a particular piece of information concerning some hypothesis, such as that someone is guilty of a crime, given some background information. So weight of evidence depends really on three items, three propositions, if you like. Now the question is, what semi-quantitative measure should that have? I say semi-quantitative because I want to measure it in terms of probabilities that have to be judged, and those judgments are not likely to be exact. And the answer comes out as the logarithm of what is usually called the Bayes factor. The expression weight of evidence hasn't yet caught on. I think it's bound to sooner or later.
Good luck.
But the Bayes factor is, let me put it this way, is the factor by which the odds of a hypothesis are multiplied in the light of the evidence.
And that gets rid of the prior, I mean in simple versus simple.
That's right, that it's the same, if measured in the usual way, as you say. It's the same whatever the prior probability might be. It has that big advantage because you don't therefore need to argue about what the prior should be, unless of course you're in a court of law, because sooner or later you've got, it seems to me, although some people disagree, that you have to estimate the probability that someone is guilty. You don't state the probability, you would be condemned for, you'd be out of court if the head juryman was to get up and say that this man is guilty with probability 0.8. And yet it was really very clear from a recent court case that that's how the jury thinks. There was one of the jurymen, it was actually a woman, after the case was all over and the guy was acquitted, who said that she believed he was guilty, but that it hadn't been proved beyond a shadow of a doubt. So there's no doubt that she had a probabilistic concept there.
But, so, you've tried to justify weight of evidence both in the brief description you just gave and in a very careful development that you've done over the years as a natural, very, very valuable tool, but your first contact with it would have been in this more practical setting, and I couldn't be revealing any confidences because I've only read what you've written in the open literature about them, but my understanding was that there was this machine that you guys were working on, which is called the Enigma, which would have wheels which would make permutations of some sort or other, and the wheels would be set various ways, and if you could guess how the wheels were set and which charts were being used in order to calibrate things, then you could decode the message, and there would be you would be receiving data and trying to in some way guess at certain things like that. And so obviously things like frequencies of words and frequencies of letters and popularities of individual letters, if you wrote that some of the input to that procedure was that the captain of the ship would have to fill in some things at random, and well, people don't fill in things at random, and you could maybe take advantage of that sort of thing.
I could give you some details because I was interviewed yesterday and gave some of the details, some of which are in the open literature. The notion of weight of evidence did arise although not called that, as I said, at the time, did arise in that connection and was used in other connections, as a matter of fact, in my work. It arose in Hut 8, as it was called, which dealt with the naval enigma, and it was Turing who suggested, I think, quite a valuable idea for selling the concept of a unit of weight of evidence. Namely, it was called a deciband, which was analogous to a decibel, but it was evidence rather than sound that we were talking about. It was very convenient to have a unit. And that was called, as I say, called the deciband. Of course, you can invent words like microband and so on, if you like.
Now you said half a deciband was the just noticeable difference.
Well, either half or a whole deciband, but I did, as a matter of fact, introduce the half deciband because it saved a lot of writing. It saved a great deal of time, curiously enough. It sounds like a very elementary idea, but I did first show that it wouldn't lose much information for the process that we were concerned with. It was called the HDB, as a matter of fact, HDB. But that topic, as you know, I've developed, and I've returned again and again to the topic of weight of evidence in my writings, trying to convince the philosophers that they ought to use this particular definition, and I've given, I think, very strong arguments. I'm sure I'll win in the end, you know, that this will be accepted as the best definition.
We've just been reviewing your early history, but something like a quarter of your career, well over 20 years, has been spent right here at VPI, and during that time you've been enormously productive, so I know that this has been a very good home for you, and I wanted to ask some questions about what that's been like. For example, you're an outspoken and very clear Bayesian, as am I, and are there any other Bayesians here?
One of our faculty said he was a Bayesian recently, having not been previously, and that was Dick Krutchkov. But when I asked him about p-values and optional stopping and stuff, I said that optional stopping is permitted in the Bayesian philosophy, for reasons that I could go into, of course, whereas in the non-Bayesian it is not permitted, and that this seemed to be an argument in favor of the Bayesian position, and he said he thought it was an argument against the Bayesian position. He felt that optional stopping should not be permitted. So it seems to me that he and many other people are brainwashed in regarding p-values. They tend to think that a given p-value has the same evidential meaning on every occasion when it's used. Even Fisher, I have quotations that I could give you from R.A. Fisher, which show that. For example, he says that when you have a p-value, a tail probability of 0.02, that is strong evidence against the null hypothesis, and when you have a p-value of 0.001, that is conclusive evidence. And yet I'm quite sure that if a tail probability of 0.001 were reached, Fisher would, in a paranormal experiment, Fisher would have regarded that merely as a curious coincidence. I'm sure he wouldn't have gone along with his own statement on that topic.
Well, that we're right at the heart of it, so let's branch in that direction for a second, if you don't mind. The likelihood principle is one very often discussed argument, and I'm as committed a subjective Bayesian as I know, and somehow the likelihood principle makes me nervous. I've never thought it through in my own language, and I think that it has to do with the complexities of the real world. I mean, it's an evident consequence of the Bayesian position, but I mean, just as a direct argument, may I ask you, do you believe the likelihood principle?
I do, provided that you are not prepared to give up the statistical model that you're using. But, yeah, I mean, this is the difference, that the likelihood can only be worked out on the assumption of some model. And if, indeed, even if I obtained a very small p-value, I would begin to suspect the model, not just the null hypothesis, if the likelihood, even if the likelihood supported my position apart from based on the model itself. If at the same time I was to obtain a very small p-value, I would be suspicious. And in fact, I think Harold Jeffreys would have agreed with that situation.
No, that has the right ring of reality to me. I mean, which your writing always has. It's sort of non-dogmatic, let's think about it like real human beings quality rather than
yes, but
here's the measure algebra.
Yeah. But it is interesting that if you take the simplest models, that if you specify some p-value, for example 0.001 even, that if the sample is large enough, that will support, not undermine, the null hypothesis if you assume the model. And it's very easy to show that. Very simple examples will show that however small the p-value is, if you are then allowed to select the sample size large enough, that will support the null hypothesis.
You have settled in here, and after, I guess, after your stint in the war, you roughly, would you fill us in a little bit on that history? I mean, there is quite a gap between the end of the war and coming here. Just a little bit of filling in, if you don't mind.
Okay, well, I went first to Manchester University, as Goldie Holtzman has mentioned, being concerned to lecture in mathematics, but also supposedly with an interest in the possibility of an electronic computer.
Mm-hmm.
Max Newman, who was then head of the department at Manchester, was rather far-looking. He looked ahead, and he realized that the computer industry would be a very large industry, that it was something that should be developed at a university apart from just Cambridge and the National Physical Laboratory. But he felt, he considered that the speciality that he'd like to see for the computer at Manchester would be doing pure mathematics on a computer. Well, he was about 30 years ahead of his time, really, in that there was such a big demand for number crunching as soon as computers were available that it was difficult for people not to get involved in that aspect. But meanwhile, I had re-entered the civil service. I was only at Manchester for just over 2 years.
So you were at Manchester, and then you spent some time at the Institute for Defense Analysis.
A couple of years there, yes.
Right, and
a few weeks at Princeton, and a few weeks at IBM.
And
then after all that, I was invited to apply for a fellowship jointly with Trinity College, Oxford, and the Atlas Computer Laboratory. And I think there were 123 applicants for that post, and I happened to be selected. Jack Howlett was in charge. His boss was Klaus Fuchs, by the way, a spy previously, so he knew him quite well. The Atlas computer, when it was first built, was the fastest computer in the world, the most powerful, presumably, in the world. After all, we do know something about Russian computers. And but only for a few months, then IBM caught up and passed the abilities of the Atlas computer.
Many of the people who are listening to this tape will be statisticians, and in some sense, the bulk of your work, or a large portion of your work, has been in the field of statistics. And there are all kinds of things that you've done and talked about. One of my favorite is your evaluation of things like Bodes Law. And Bodes Law is roughly a geometrical progression of the distances of the planets from the Earth, or from the Sun anyway. And they form quite a striking pattern, but it's only 5 or 6 long. And this law had some predictive power, as you've said, and you addressed the question which seems to me fundamental for modern data analysis, which is Bodes Law just an accident of data snooping and fitting lots of patterns to numbers, or is there really something there? And just to have the nerve to ask a question like that. And then I agree that the discussion that surrounded it is outrageous in our statistics literature, but for many of our points of view, you triumphed. I mean, you had something to say in an almost impossible problem, and it's been very influential. I wonder if you think now we're about to get close enough to other planets so that we'll be able to see what the other solar systems, so we'll be able to see whether their planets have a rough progression. Do you think Bodes Law will hold up?
I suspect so. I tend to believe that there is some causal reason for it. Astronomers previously had discussed it. Some of them said this is clearly just a coincidence. Others have said that they believe that it has some reason. Others have tried to explain it. None of them use a basic philosophical approach to getting down to the statistical and probabilistic and philosophical aspects. They just come up with an overall judgment about it. And in fact, one of these astronomers, I think, contradicted herself in the same sentence on the topic.
But the problem of trying to cope with the power that we have in modern data analysis, if you look at a big mass of data now with automatic curve fitting algorithms, you can do whatever you want to do in some sense, and then how do you quantify whether you've actually discovered something or it's just got,
Yeah, there ought to be a way, instead of just relying on a kind of Popper philosophy that the only thing you can do is to refute the statements. There ought to be a Bayesian way of more or less evaluating theories, and I selected Bodes Law because it was one of the simplest things to consider, rather than some much more difficult problem. But of course, in the case of, say, special relativity versus Newtonian models, you can at any rate come up, I think, with some kind of likelihood ratio, and you can then interpret that as a Bayes factor, and then you have to ask yourself, what are the prior probabilities? And then you discover that whether you like it or not, you are, in effect, assuming implicitly some prior probabilities. It's often called, in effect, Occam's razor. It's really due to Duns Scotus, but the fact that simplicity is a criterion, it may not be a very good criterion, but it's perhaps one of the only ones we know for estimating prior probabilities. So one is forced, if one is going to try to give a rational reason for preferring one theory, one physical theory to another, somehow implicitly there's an initial probability there, and the same is true in a court of law.
You won't get any argument from me, but I can imagine that there are lots of people who would argue with the two of us. How did you become a Bayesian? You didn't, well, I guess you read Ramsey, you said.
Yes, exactly. I think that reading Ramsey, reading Jeffreys, and reading Keynes were all influential in making me think in a more fundamental way than people who are brainwashed by formulae in a typical statistics course. I think people reach a point where they begin to feel that philosophy has nothing to do with it, whereas my view, and I think yours, is that one should return again and again to the philosophical basis of what you're doing.
You've written about all aspects of the Bayesian position, but I found something that I found, well, I don't know if jarring is the right word, but you wrote a paper about the foundations of data analysis.
A philosophical paper.
Right, and which was an important paper, and I've discussed it in work I've written, but I've been troubled by how hard it is to be an honest Bayesian in the face of data, real data, the problem being that when the scientist walks through their door with their massive data, if you start trying to quantify everything you know before you look at the data, well, it's just crazy, because as soon as you look at the data, you'll realize, oh, I never even thought of that, and so you somehow, you shouldn't, waste time in those initial phases, and that this sort of graphical machinery that Tukey and company have evolved has a real value. And yet, in the middle of that, in which you actually contributed some very nice ideas, sort of practical data analytic techniques, you say that this shows, the power of Bayesian methods because of something about hypothesis formation. And I couldn't see how you would have me being a Bayesian in a data analytic sea.
Well, it seemed to me that a data analyst is looking for patterns, any patterns. So as you just now said, you can't list all possible patterns that the data analyst might think about. But the patterns that are of interest to him are those that are either simple enough or simple enough modulo some theory to look as if they might have an explanation. That they are, so to speak, causal patterns.
I see.
And that seems to me like a Bayesian judgment.
And one could even try to get somewhat quantitative about that.
One can try, yes, yes.
It could be.
And of course, probability inequalities come in there very forcibly, in my opinion, rather than sharp estimates of probabilities.
Who were, in England, who were the statistical influences on you?
Well, the people I've mentioned, the books. Harold Jeffreys, not from his lectures, but from his book. And Turing was certainly an influence on me. I often had intellectual discussions with him. He never mentioned Bayes until I did, by the way.
Oh.
I mean, he was using this Bayes factor method without using the word Bayes. I came in one morning, I said, isn't this really essentially a Bayesian procedure? And he said, well, I suppose so. A little reluctantly.
I see. What about people like, who you interacted a lot with, like Fisher?
I didn't interact a lot with Fisher. I interacted only a little bit with Fisher in a social kind of way, except on one occasion when he lost his temper with me in a colloquium when Braithwaite was the main lecturer. I made the remark from the floor in the discussion that the trouble with objectivistic methods, even those of R.A. Fisher, is that it's necessary to throw away some of the evidence. And at that point, Fisher stood up with a white face and said, please address your comments to what the speaker said. And so I wrote to him and I said, I'd be sorry if we fell out. And he wrote back and he said, well, he thought perhaps it was a setup, that we'd both been invited as discussants in the hope of having some kind of a mudslinging session, which of course was not the intention at all. So that got smoothed over, and I don't think I had any further trouble with Fisher. Now, Fisher had a reputation for having a bad temperature. Even his daughter, in her well-known book, does mention that fact. But what is much less well known is that Fisher admitted this to George Barnard once. Fisher said it was the bane of his existence, the fact he had a bad temper. And somehow one feels more humanly disposed to him.
Slightly. He wasn't a very nice man, from all reports. Is my overall impression. If I can, I'd love to get you to speculate, as you've asked people so often to do, about the future of statistics. You have thought hard about things like artificial intelligence. Do you think statistical expert systems will come to the fore? Where do you think statistics is headed?
Well, I could start at a higher level and ask whether I believe that ultra-intelligent machines will be produced sooner or later.
UIM.
Yes, UIMs. And unfortunately, I do believe that sooner or later they'll be produced. But assuming they're not, then my main prediction, I should say, about statistics is that a Bayes-non-Bayes compromise will eventually be accepted as the appropriate basic philosophy.
Could you say what you mean by a Bayes-non-Bayes compromise?
Well, it's not easy to define.
I know.
Because it hasn't been worked out in sufficient detail. I do have a recent paper on this topic, in fact. It will be coming out in JASA. But basically, it's based on the following notion, that if you really believe in sharp probabilities, that you really can arrive at your sharp subjective probabilities, then you are what you might call a sharp Bayesian, an extreme Bayesian, if you like. But in practice, these probabilities are not necessarily that sharp. And the less sharp they are, the more you say, well, I may as well protect my backside by being a non-Bayesian on this problem. To admit that there are situations where you may as well follow the crowd. But of course you can try both methods. I think there's an early paper by Cedric Smith in which he gives both a Bayesian and a non-Bayesian analysis of a problem some decades ago. But at any rate, that is one form of the compromise, is to give both.
But part of it is also this notion of building in the cost of computation as a practical issue.
Oh yes, well, right. The basic principle of rationality in Bayesian statistics is simply maximize the expected utility. You can imagine people going around with banners. It's a new political movement. But in practice, you can't always think things out in sufficient detail. You do have to allow for the cost of thinking, of calculation, either human calculation or computer calculation. At some stage, you have to make your mind up. And the more urgent the situation, the more far off from strict rationality you might be. You might even panic in some situations. So therefore, what you do, in my opinion, is you do allow, as best you can, for these costs. Those are not built into the formal extreme Bayesian situation. It's rather assumed that those costs are zero and that you can think as far as you like. Well, we know from Gödel's theorem that you can't do that, if you like, if you want to be abstract about it. So you make some kind of a judgment, I think, implicit judgment, not necessarily conscious, but an implicit judgment of the cost of these calculations and build that in to the principle of rationality. I call this type 2 rationality.
It's hard to do.
Well, but it's something you do all the time.
It's true. So it's hard to do consciously, I guess. It is true. We make that kind of judgment all the time. But if you try to actually think, how long is this going to take me? Laplace is supposed to have done that. You know, he's supposed to have thought whether he should make certain astronomical calculations. What's the chance that I'll succeed in carrying this out, and that if I carry it out, it'll be interesting? That's supposed to be in the method, you know, the celestial analytique.
Oh, not in his probability.
No, that's curious. He has a lot of probability in the celestial mechanics book.
Oh yes. Well, chess is a very good example. If you're playing chess with a clock, or even without, but especially with a clock, you know that time is limited. One cost, if you go on thinking, is that you just lose on the clock. So what do you do about it? What you do is you analyze forward where you think you should analyze forward in the tree of analysis, and you stop at, if you like, quiescent positions, or you might even stop before you get to quiescent positions because you're running out of time. So you make some kind of a judgment based on all that boil-up of ideas. And it's that boil-up of ideas which is one reason why I think that chess is quite a good education, as a matter of fact, for ordinary life.
When I think about this philosophical speculation, I often think, well, what is this actually about? What does it get down to? And when I was reading one of your papers and preparing for this interview, I was reading your slogan about maximize expected utility, and I came across the following sentence, which is, maximizing expected utility teaches us that the older we become, the more important it is to use what we know rather than to learn more. Well, that just hit me like a ton of bricks. I am getting older, and maybe it's time to take that information to heart. It's a marvelous insight, and just the kind of thing that makes philosophizing come to life, I think. And now, does that apply to you?
Maybe not as much as it should. Donald, who's a good friend of mine, recommended me years and years ago that I should focus more. And obviously I'm not someone who focuses that much because my interest is so wide. But certainly what this statement amounts to is that as you get older, you should really focus more. If you have some ideas that you feel should be worked out before you become a nonagenarian, let's say, you'd better get to it. The advice is given all over the place in different words. Imagine that you're to be hanged the next day. Who was it who said that it sharpens the mind wonderfully to feel that you're very short of time, something like that.
But I love that it's a consequence of maximizing expected utility.
Yes. Well, that really covers everything in a nutshell. In fact, the first sentence of my paper on rational decisions is we consider the first two sentences, we consider the following problem. Given various circumstances, what should we do?
One thing that I think might help people here is some indication of how one might try to access your work. I found Good Thinking, which this looks like a TV ad for a book, to be spectacular in that you've given a lot of help and pointers and cross-references, and is that a reasonable way to go about finding out about what Jack Good's about?
I think it is, except the book is out of print, but I do have a number of copies available still.
But one can find the books in libraries, and if this interview fires people up, maybe it'll get back into print. One never knows.
Well, who knows? But if you want a really quick course on my thinking, have a look at the indexes. There are two indexes of Good Thinking. One is an index of the book, and the other is an index of my publications. And as a friend of mine once pointed out, if he wants to understand what a book is all about, he doesn't look at the contents, he looks at the index. If you look at my index, which was very carefully prepared, it took about 8 weeks, I think you will find that you can get a good impression of my general point of view. It contains a few jokes, by the way.
Well, I'll have to look out for those. In thinking about preparing for this interview, one is overwhelmed. You've written, 1,000, 2,000 papers, and there, many books and comments. And how does one prepare and take a crash course? And I realized that I've been preparing this for all my statistical career. I and many, many other people read the things you write and take them very seriously and struggle and do the best we can at trying to make sense out of it. And you've certainly enlivened my part of the world. And I thank you very much for taking the time and energy to do this interview.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Jack. For me, those kinds of axiomatic developments sort of leave me cold, and even though I try to do them myself too, and somehow seeing something actually applied and used and the way it works out is just much more compelling. And I think one of the things that sort of blocked the more widespread use of that is the fact that you've been banned from saying this very, very successful application until just around now. And I do have a feeling that when the a clear description of just what you did and how you used it comes out, that people will say, oh, that's terrific. What else has he done about that? So I'm making good predictions.
Well, another philosophical application I can mention, because it's recent, is in relation to probabilistic causality.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at the time I first wrote about this, was 1961 or so, most philosophers were interested in causality naturally, of course. It was one of these abstract terms that they were trying to explain. But I was more interested in probabilistic causality, and I came up with the concept of to what extent one event, or I got interested in the topic, if you like, of the extent to which one event, say F, tended to cause another event E. And I used the letter Q for that, as a matter of fact. That was because C had already been preempted. Now, I decided, for various arguments, connected with an analogy between causal circuits and electrical circuits. I arrived at the quantitative suggestion that the tendency that I just mentioned could be explicated by the weight of evidence against F if E does not occur. It could be that even if you have a different interpretation for weight of evidence, that would still make some kind of sense. But the recent development of that was to discover that there are really two different probabilistic tendencies, and this I haven't yet published, but it will be in the Gassi Festschrift, he's a philosopher, was to notice that there is a tendency for F to be a sufficient cause for E, and there is another different tendency for F to be a necessary cause for E. And that one is I think the weight of evidence if E occurs in favor of F. It's simpler, but that one's the necessary. Usually when you talk about causality, you're more interested in sufficient causes than necessary.
This is hard for me without an example. Do you have a favorite? I mean, for Q, for example, do you have a favorite example of?
Well, the firing squad is an example. Someone says F, meaning fire, and the event ending occurs at the other end. This is a simple circuit consisting of a single link.
Right.
And there you can just estimate the probabilities and allow for a circuit consisting of a number of sharpshooters.
And so the saying of firing has a strong tendency to cause the death
yes,
of...
and for certain kinds of circuit, I think parallel circuits, the degree of causation is probabilistic is additive, and if you have a chain, it's multiplicative. I may have the wrong way around, but this sort of rough idea that the circuit approach has. But a more recent approach was simply to assume that Q should be one of the 16 possibilities for the weight of evidence concerning A provided by B, where A is either E or not E, or F or not F, and so is B. There are 16 possibilities there, and it's rather easy to rule out 14 of them. In fact, you can even think of it as a kind of knockout tournament. The first 8 get knocked out for very obvious reasons, because they only involve E all the time, or F all the time. That obviously won't do. And then you can knock out another 4 because they obviously have the wrong sign. And then you're left with 4 of these, and 2 of them you knock out for a more interesting reason, and that is that the weight of that the degree of causality from F to E, or the tendency, ought not to depend on the prior probability of F, because you can control the prior probability of F in an experiment. And that should have nothing to do with the degree to which F has a tendency to cause E. That knocks out two more and you're left with these finalists. And both these finalists make sense, one of them being a tendency to be a sufficient cause and the other to be a tendency to be a necessary cause. And there are other properties, rather nice properties, that these have. So philosophically, I think that's rather satisfactory. Applications, well, they might come later. I think Donald Mickey, who is here at present as a visiting professor, believes that this concept will be of great importance to the work he's doing in AI.
Well, I think that that's one of your ideas that a number of philosophers have taken to heart and worked out their own variations of. Pat Supes and some other people.
Yes, Patrick Supes has written a little book on probabilistic causality. I think he worked nearly the whole book out for himself, but he does acknowledge the fact that my paper exists and recommends people to read it on about the first page.
That's
the notion of probabilistic causality has created a fair amount of interest. Perhaps a dozen philosophers or so are interested in the topic now, whereas I recall in 1961 a philosopher sitting next to me at a banquet when I raised the issue said, well, I'm not interested in probabilistic causality, I'm only interested in causality. Determinism, he meant.
Well, maybe that's a good moment to take a break. I thought that another way to break down things. So far, we've broken things down historically, and thank you for enduring that, because I know that, that you're thinking about what you're thinking about now, and rooting around in history isn't so much fun. But the three of the many areas that you've worked in are sort of, probability and statistics and mathematics and philosophy. That's four now. Okay, so four of the many areas, and that would be another way to break things down, and maybe it makes some sense to try to say some things in a more directed way that way. I noticed that you love the philosophy that you think about and try to get the rest of us to look at it and think about it. And I always feel, I've done my share also in doing that, but I always feel it's too bad that more attention isn't paid to the mathematical things that you've done. You've done such beautiful things in mathematics. You're awfully good at it, and somehow we never get a chance to celebrate that. But your one-page proof of the Dyson conjecture is something that people in combinatorics and Lie theory just have devoured, and it's a very widely cited paper. Your beautiful work with McMahon's master theorem, and just things in day-to-day statistics. If one reads your technical statistical paper, I mean, there's just a superb analyst lurking behind those funny little twists of language, and is there some reason that you don't play that up? Or, I mean, I notice, and I'm sure that it's true, that you when asked, you prefer to speak about your philosophy than your mathematics. It feels that way to me. Does that have the ring of truth to it?
It probably does, although I still do enjoy doing pure mathematics when I happen to come up against a problem. Very often it's something that arises out of an application, but not always. I've recently written a paper on the theory of numbers for the Festschrift for Stefan Weider, who wrote a book about Fibonacci numbers, for example, and I think that will go down fairly well amongst the mathematicians. That has not much connection with probability, except that nearly every mathematical combinatorial problem involves some experimentation. So that one really has if you like, a data handling problem to handle, to explain why certain results are popping up. And so in that respect, the pure mathematician is a data analyst.
It's certainly true. I'm constantly getting into arguments with a friend of mine who's a physicist who says we mathematicians, the mathematical parts of us, aren't scientists because it's all just deductions, and she just doesn't know what she's talking about, right? We look at data, we compute examples, and then we try to find patterns, just like the physicists do.
Exactly.
And do you have a favorite mathematics paper, or is that a silly question?
It is difficult for me to choose. The trouble is I get anticipated from time to time. I wrote a paper that I would have regarded as one of my most favourite
Which is that?
papers on the Lagrange expansion, the multivariate Lagrange expansion.
That's a beautiful paper.
But of course the application was there too. But the pure mathematics, I think I was essentially anticipated by the great Jacobi 150 years ago or so. And I couldn't be blamed really, because the other people who'd been writing about the problem hadn't gone beyond the two-dimensional case, such as Gorsar and some other people. And I think, was it Poincaré? I'm not sure.
But this is the multivariate revision of series, the Lagrange inversion theorem.
That's right,
and,
yes.
And you certainly wrote a paper on multivariate Lagrange inversion, which has been very influential and is readable. I mean, you've got examples and a theorem.
Oh, yes, oh, sure. But I was a bit disappointed to find that the basic mathematical result there had been essentially anticipated. And as I say, it wasn't my fault entirely, because these other people did not cite Jacobi.
Well, I didn't know that reference until just now, and I've just written something about multivariate Lagrange inversion, and I cite you, so I'll have to do my homework.
There was another bit of pure mathematics I did that also arose out of a statistics problem, which was concerned with, how can I put it, with sequences of letters and the way that you could build up words from these sequences, a typical kind of...
The prime...
that's right, the prime words.
In the Journal of Combinatorial Theory.
That's right. I was very pleased with that. Then I discovered that was largely anticipated by Marshall Hall. It was a whole chapter of one of his books. And when I spoke to him about it, he said, oh, it was anticipated by Philip Hall.
Right.
In his turn.
Right. Well, but both halls were much more algebraic, and as I remember that paper, you actually had an analog of the prime number theorem, and you had some analysis.
Oh, yes. Well, yeah, you're right. I gave a colloquium on this in the mathematics department once.
At Albany once, when I was there.
Oh, yes. Oh, I see. Yeah, but here, and one of the faculty said he'd now understood the problem for the first time, having previously been trying to read the previous literature. So it helped, certainly, even though it was largely anticipated.
That helps me, and again, I didn't know it was anticipated. I'll have to go figure it out. Did you know Jeffries?
Not very well. I was a student at one of his courses.
Is he a student of W.E. Johnson?
Well, I made a mistake about that, by the way, in a preface of one of my books. It was not Harold Jeffries, it was his co-worker Dorothy Rynch, who was a student of W.E. Johnson, and so was Keynes. Keynes was
right. And Ramsey? We don't know
Probably,
for sure.
I don't know.
Yeah. That was a marvelous argument of yours about, speaking about roughness penalties. W.E. Johnson had a beautiful theorem which you brought back to life. This is very early on, which said that if the way you predict about several categories, say things are coming out and they're red, white, and blue, and you've seen the past, and then you've got to predict what the next one will be. If the probabilities you assign only depend on the past through the number of reds and the number of whites and blues lumped together, then your a Bayesian with a Dirichlet prior is the modern way of saying it, and that's. But you said, well, Johnson's argument isn't quite right. That is, if you look at the counts and if they're very rough, then that you would probably not take that so seriously.
Well, I took it seriously, except it needed to be modified. So in a sense, I wasn't taking it quite as seriously. But what W. Johnson had shown was that under his assumptions, one of which was permutability, which is the same as exchangeability in modern terminology, you could arrive at the following estimate. If you had Ni successes, or let's say N1 successes in the first category, out of a sample size of big N, the result of his argument was that you should add some constant k to all the frequencies. It's the kind of thing there again that a non-Bayesian might do just as an ad hoc procedure. But he showed, under the assumptions that he made, which were similar to what you said, that some constant k, but he didn't specify the constant k, should be added as if one was buttering everything uniformly before making the estimate. Now the question is, how do you estimate k? And that's where what you just said comes in. That the roughness of the other frequencies, which were not supposed to be relevant to the problem, given the sample size big N and N1, he assumed that the other frequencies would be irrelevant. That was one of his assumptions to arrive at this conclusion. I said, okay, let's use the roughness of the other frequencies, as you mentioned, to try to estimate k. And that leads to a kind of hierarchical model. And in fact, that's really what got me onto the idea of hierarchical Bayesian procedures.
Now, hierarchical Bayesian procedures are now a real mainstay of applied statistical work. In particular, it's being fought now in the courts of America whether the census counts will be adjusted by a rather fanciful, complicated hierarchical Bayesian procedure, and whether they will or won't, applied workers all over the country are testing and thinking about those procedures. Can I get you to talk some about the history of that? Because in a sense, they go back to your work with Turing. In a pretty clear sense, they go back to your work with Turing during the war.
Well, they only look as if they do in a way, because the so-called species sampling problem is a multinomial sampling problem.
The species sampling problem is what?
You have a sample of animals of various species, say lions, tigers, and so on, and you find that there are N subscript tigers,
right?
N subscript lion, lions. Now, how do you estimate the probability that the next animal you come across will be a tiger? Do you simply take N subscript tiger divided by the total number of animals sampled?
No.
That would be the maximum likelihood estimate, and that would be a rather bad estimate, because if you make that assumption and you now ask yourself what coverage you have of the population, you discover that it has to be 100%. In other words, that the probability that you will get an animal of a new species is 0. So you have to do something about that. And Turing faced this problem in a special case and came up with a formula which I modified and expanded a great deal in a 1953 paper, which was a little surprising and really anticipated a form of the empirical Bayes as originally defined by
Robbins.
By Herbert Robbins, who I regard as a pioneer nevertheless, even if he was anticipated by this piece of work to some degree. Now that...
it is a surprising result. What is the result that can you remember, if you want to predict what's the chance that the next thing is a new one?
It's something like if you've had say n subscript r of the R species, it's something like r plus 1 times nr plus 1 over nr. I can't remember exactly, but it's approximately that. But you need to smooth these nrs, which I call frequencies of frequencies, by the way. for fairly obvious reasons if you think about it. Yes, it is a surprising formula. Now, that differs from ordinary multinomial sampling simply because you have the number of categories in most reasonable applications of that work is extremely large. And it really is, it's a case of a different quantitative phenomenon, a different quantitative problem, leading to qualitatively different results. If you have an ordinary multinomial, shall we say, with 20 categories, or with 3 in your red, white, and blue case, you simply couldn't even begin to think about using that particular formula we just mentioned. It's a different problem because it deals with a different order of size of the number of categories. So, in that sense, they're different problems, even though logically they sound at first sight as if they're dealing with the same problem, namely the multinomial. Entirely different methods. The ordinary multinomial is the one that is related to W. E. Johnson's work and this extension and the hierarchical Bayes procedure.
I see. And this one is for large, sparse problems.
Yes, and in fact the neatest formula in that work is that the probability that the next animal you see will belong to a new species is simply approximately n1, which I'll define, divided by the sample size, where n1 is the number of species each represented once.
And that formula was due to you and Turing, or?
Well, I think it was me. I don't think Turing came up with that particular example.